Turnabout Sisters was actually written as the first case of the Ace Attorney series, but was reworked to come after a shorter introductory case that sets up Mia and Phoenix's relationship and gives you a chance to practice the courtroom battle in a safer, simpler environment before you get thrown into the story-heavy cases and long investigation sequences. Like most of the decisions made about how to sequence and present information in the original Ace Attorney series, this is just plain good design. The first Turnabout and Turnabout Sisters punch so much harder because of the way they're oriented next to one another. Of course, that means Turnabout Sisters is the case a decades-old and highly successful series gets to introduce itself in full. This is the second introductory case. It's easy to forget, but this case really established decades of tone, localization practice, ludus, and every other reason this series is so well loved. Keeping in that vein, this second video about the second case in the series in my planned series of videos is going to be a bit longer and establish the framework I want to talk about these games under. And really, there's a lot to talk about. This is a tremendously interesting series in its sort of weird development, being arguably the best visual novel of all time and having a really engaging cultural intersection in its localization. So here's the framework, and I'll introduce a few of the starring characters of this game's production. Every element of the finished product, the characters, their manner of speaking, the settings, music, puzzles, name puns, cultural references, etc., we will try to answer under the following 4 questions. Firstly, why the attorney premise? We could talk about writer and director Shu Takumi for a lot of this. A lot of the puzzles and the way things are arranged, the scenarios are written, are to accommodate this, and it seems like the starting point for talking about this game and series. Secondly, why visual novels? Again, we can turn to a lot of the writing and production for this, but seeing as this is probably the best text-based game series of all time, we have to ask ourselves how the genre informed the game and the game informed the genre. Thirdly, how was this made specifically for the Game Boy Advance? For this, we can think of producer Atsushi Inaba, composer Masasaku Sugimori, artist Tatsuro Iwamoto, and programmer Noriyuki Otani to name a good number of this small team. The hardware limitations, the sound chip, the palette, the portable nature of the console all have a really large weight in making demands about the final product. Again, the medium is kind of the message here. To quote Takumi, "I was really attracted to the Game Boy Advance from the start. I thought it was a really great gaming device and fell in love with it right away. I didn't want to do CG on the GBA, which I still think looks bad. Instead, I think the way we've handled the graphics in Gyakuten Saiban is still fresh and new. The Game Boy Advance is also an easier device to develop for than some other systems," end quote. And lastly, how did the localization of this series to the West shape it? For this, I'll mostly talk about Ben Judd, who handled the first localization, and Janet Shu, who handled every subsequent localization in the series. Localization directors for English-speaking audiences are secondary authors, and they create a lot of what English-speaking audiences clicked with about the game. And they also create the textual voices of all the characters. Phoenix, Maya, and every other memorable side character has a really significant fraction of their essence in a text-based game created by choosing the specific flavor of how they speak English. There's also a lot of interest in the cultural fusion in Ace Attorney's San Francisco-style universe, which informed a lot of the decisions made in regards to culture. Okay, we'll return to this framework repeatedly, but now let's start to talk about Ace Attorney 1-2, Turnabout Sisters. We open on a black screen in a phone conversation between Mia Fey and someone named Maya. The black screen here is threefold. First off, this conversation is really important and it pays to not have a bunch of extra visual stimulus. Secondly, we get a bit of build up here to who this Maya person is, and in a visual novel series, it pays handily to be able to paint pictures and scenarios and conversations in your head. Lastly, the Game Boy Advance is low on space. There's a lot of this, and the moments that we can sustain ourselves on a shaky screen for action or imagine characters or scenarios, the better. And it's kind of stunning how much personality they gave Maya through this green text on a black screen. Her voice is immediately distinct. Mia asks Maya to hand onto the thinker clock from the first trial. We can put together that Mia is older than Maya and that they have a big sister, little sister relationship. Maya says she's down if they can get some burgers later, and Mia agrees. Localization here is noteworthy for changing ramen to the original to burgers. We see our first non-courtroom set, a very pretty blue tinted room as these two characters speak. The one represented by question marks tells Mia he knows she hid the papers in the thinker. "You're not cognivorous of my background?" The suspense music cuts in as we see Mia duck away from a man in a pink suit swinging the thinker as Mia thuds to the ground. A lot is done well here. With a single picture of this guy and some lines of text, we get a really wonderful picture of him. Cogniferous sounds like a cognizant or cognition or cognitive, but the word's made up. It's kind of shocking that easily the coolest character we've met so far has just been struck and maybe dead. It's also very interesting that for the second case in a row, and for not that many cases ever, we get to see the murderer before the case starts. There's a lot of new info here, and it's really important that we know going into this case that Maya is innocent. Phoenix enters the office and smells blood. We're allowed to control, and we get to pick from examine and move. The subtle direction of how this new type of gameplay, the exploration phase, works is very clever and clean. We don't have to be told to move. We really want to rush in without any explicit request from the game. We hear sobbing and see a young girl crying next to the corpse of Mia Fey. The girl faints as Phoenix lays her on the sofa. The investigation core theme plays, and it's never going to stop being worth mentioning how banging this soundtrack is front to back. We find some glass shards, the Thinker statue, and a note with the name Maya written in blood. We can examine around and learn that Mia was bad with computers and got this ancient computer at a garage sale. One of the supreme strengths of this investigation mode is getting to hear Phoenix's voice as he and his company examine the environment. A lot of players like me insist on clicking every single little thing because when Maya joins and these two goons start cooking together, it always makes for some of the funniest character building moments in the series. Phoenix calls the police, and across the road, someone shouts for help, and Phoenix looks out to see a pink-haired woman shouting and clutching a phone. The pacing of how quickly we're fed new information is great. As soon as we acclimate, we get something new to consider. Did this person see the murder? The girl wakes up and introduces herself as Maya, which we recognize as the name on the receipt. We show her the receipt and she looks shocked. Maya's sprite and posing is perfect. To make a visual novel feel right, you kind of have to nail the posing and make the most out of what you can with a few poses and blinks and mouth movements. And Maya is designed perfectly. Her little crying eyes are too much. The police pull up, and a green refrigerator in the vague shape of a detective arrives with a pencil behind his ear, pop collar, loose tie, and a bandage on his cheek, maybe from shaving. He's saying like "see" at the end of his sentences, which is hilarious because he introduces himself as Detective Dick Gumshoe with 2 detective name puns, so he's basically introducing himself as Detective. Once again, his manner of speaking is entirely distinct and characterizing immediately. Gumshoe finds the note and decides Maya is guilty, and as we're still trying to get a read on him, this little like worm move he does with his eyebrows really sells him as being kind of a dumbass. The case is closed in half a minute as Gumshoe takes Maya away to the precinct. We follow her to the detention center and get a really sad song and a really sad look. A lot is happening very quickly, but lots of credit to this case for never really losing its audience's attention. The case doesn't dwell on anything and passes out information exactly quick enough to be stimulating. We finally get to sit down and talk to her, introducing us to a new way to interact with this segment. Maya tells Phoenix Mia told her about him. It's actually kind of heart-wrenching and engaging to see this little triangle of these 3 interacting and grieving over a shared loss. Hilariously, Mia told Maya if she got into trouble to wait a few years before hiring Phoenix. Phoenix asks about her outfit and, surprise, she's a spirit medium. This is not really a genre or mechanical thing, it's sort of embedded into the premise of Ace Attorney, but it's kind of genius to introduce people who can commune with the dead in a game about increasingly strange murders. And really crazy is that it's not actually really used in any of the puzzles or murders for this first game. It gets used for an entirely different purpose in this first game. Speaking of, Maya hangs her head and says she's not advanced enough to channel Mia yet. The conversation about the Thinker, Maya tells us, is still on her cell phone. Phoenix pledges to find a more experienced attorney to help Maya and is given the name of an attorney that worked with Mia and knows Maya. Good setup. Gumshoe is back at the crime scene, and again, they really crushed his animation and posing. His chuckle, his little smirk, his head scratch. Extreme himbo. They planted the seeds for this dude to be like the most likable guy in the game, even though right now the player is still trying to suss him out and kind of has a bit of an unclear relationship with him. We hear about the rival prosecutor, Genius Miles Edgeworth, and Phoenix says to himself, I never thought I'd face him so soon. Great intrigue. It's just small enough to be engaging, but not quite worth worrying about yet. When finally we get to the story of their childhood, it's really well set up. We can talk to Gumshoe about the evidence. He has sort of no clue about anything. He gets tricked into giving the phone back, and we get a cute little Steel Samurai setup. This game is excellent because it really sets up every ball it's going to swing at as soon as possible and kind of lets it all marinate. Gumshoe tells you he can't tell you anything about April May or which hotel room she's staying in, and Phoenix is like, yeah man, knew that wouldn't get you, because he just kind of told us who she is and where she's staying. We travel to the Gatewater and get really the first good impression that Phoenix can't talk to women, which I love. Phoenix says he pities the lawyer who's going to have to cross-examine her, and we kind of raise our eyebrows because, yeah, that's you, dude. April May is really well designed, I think. Frameworks 2 and 3. If you're going to make a visual novel and you're limited on space, how do you quickly and concisely convey the change in temperature around this woman when Phoenix bothers her by rooting around in her drawer? She returns from the bathroom, the screen flashes and shakes, and she has a very new set of eyes and a new smile, and without any diegetic thought from Phoenix, we see that she's 1, performing, and 2, very irritable. She keeps her little cutesy voice and manner of speaking, but with tens of pixels and a pretty basic camera effect, we get a really good sense of who she is, and that she knows more about this murder than she's letting on. I don't adore April May, but I do really like the way she makes Phoenix squirm because he is so hopeless at conversing with women. We move to the Grossberg Law Office, and the set design does a really fantastic job of drawing into focus the specific character of the painting on his wall. It seems obvious, but what's on Grossberg's shelf? We spend hours in the law office. What's on those paintings? Now, what's on the painting behind Grossberg? Framework 3. With a limited palette, limited space, limited attention span, getting an audience to lock in immediately on the most important details before they know they're important is really hard to do right and goes unnoticed as the connective tissue making everything feel coherent when it does go right. Grossberg says he's not very busy these days, and we mention Maya Fey, and a ringing sound effect plays as Grossberg lowers his head and opens his eyes. Only the position of his head changes, but his sprite is suddenly sweating and frowning, looking up at Phoenix nervously. He suddenly changes his story, and now he's too busy and can't work tomorrow, despite not being told when the case was. His theme is this slow, swinging, lilty song. It feels sort of like an old, lazy dude like Grossberg is. It's obvious that Phoenix is going to defend Maya in this case, but it's really important that we get to see the status quo of defense attorneys. We have very limited hardware to introduce characters, and getting to see a really weak, cowardly defense attorney really puts the way Phoenix acts in a different light. Grossberg insists he's sorry, but no lawyer worth his salt will take this case. He also insists he refuses to sell the painting. He estimates at $3 million. Okay, no taken. We tell Maya the situation, and even sadder music plays as Maya listens to her sister's voice again on the phone. No punches pulled. Maya also mentions DL6. Again, just lining up this really tight interwoven single story is difficult, and they do so well. Maya looks defeated, and we have a choice. If we decide not to defend her, there's this joke, guilty verdict where Phoenix is not and offers to defend her, and he's got a lot of heart. We flash to Phoenix sobbing as a child. He's got genuine stake in this for kind of a lot of reasons. Someone has to look out for the people who have no one on their side. Maya, I won't abandon you. You can count on me. We haven't really met the real Maya yet, but this is pretty close to the real Phoenix. He's an awkward, boring clown, but he's a really stand-up guy, and he pretty consistently does the right thing, and he's also pretty clever and has a good head for defense. Before the trial, we move to the Gatewater and meet a bellboy who's called Bellboy. He's got a good design. He's a bit plain, but he's just suspicious enough that we aren't really able to entirely deduce that he's not in on this somehow. A screwdriver sticking out of the drawer leads Phoenix to a wiretap in April May's drawer. Phoenix grits his teeth, and we get the to be continued on the way to trial day 1. Okay, so let's talk about the first framework, the attorney premise. This and most investigation sequences are so addictive and just build the case so wonderfully because this isn't really a game about being an attorney. The fundamental push-pull comes when you get to leave the courtroom, talk to new characters, investigate new murders, and find buried clues in these sequences. This series is about being an attorney and a detective. The series was actually conceived originally as a story about a detective who had to take up his own defense. There really has to be this sort of longer sequence where you get to methodically learn about a crime and cast of characters as you form and load bullets, so when you get to the courtroom, it's more satisfying to unload them. An investigation sequence where you don't get to show off the things you paid close attention to and don't get to engage with a mystery as someone trying to solve it is not satisfying. It's also not satisfying to be handed all of the clues and to be asked to put them together in court. Being able to investigate lets the case simmer in a way that's really viscerally satisfying, and it allows for really complex mysteries as the series grows and the cases get more difficult. Trying to build the world and narrative in your head without spending a few hours with it, without visiting this scene or scenes of the crime, without meeting everyone, and getting to form your own impression of them is also just not fully satisfying. The jury go, and across from us is a man in a burgundy suit. The gavel bangs and oh my god, he's gay. He's so gay. I really like the story that Shu Takumi and the team unintentionally created so many excellent gay characters in this game, and kind of created really good gay characters later in the series for my money, because the dude is just dripping with yaoi. I'd better not show any signs of weakness today or he'll be all over me in an instant. Edgeworth starts pretty humbly. He's mostly business to start. We'll get a sense of his presence soon. The big advantage here is that we've been in court before, so while the investigation had to introduce itself, the court sequence can pretty much begin its first set of iterations and manipulations to the formula of the first case. Maya chucks a note at Phoenix telling him to remember to press, which is funny. She truly does not have a lot of faith in Phoenix. Edgeworth kind of nips at Phoenix a bit and has some nice little pompous animations, but is generally reserved so far. The victim apparently wrote Maya's name in blood on the scrap of paper before she died. This is an easy contradiction, and it's supposed to be a dunk. Mia Fey died immediately and wouldn't have been able to write anything. Check. And now, enter the first iteration under lenses 1 and 2. This is generally a pretty simple game mechanically. There's only a few options for what to present or press, and there's a pretty easy flowchart for how conversations and progressions go in court. How then do you make Phoenix and the player feel tension and stress and stakes? Our expectations get manipulated a little here. The premise of playing as a lawyer in a text-based game is fine, but the true flavor here is in the way we feel in the middle of this flowchart. When we present the autopsy, the music stops. Phoenix taps the paper, and Miles Edgeworth taps his finger and tells you that your autopsy report is outdated. It changes the rules of what we expect to happen in this interaction, and it feels terrible. We're denied the clean shot, denied the really satisfying music and making the prosecutor sweat. Even if mechanically we've made progress through the flowchart, the most important thing in this and every case, totally forgetting logic or what's legal or realistic, is how we feel when Edgeworth does one of his little animations and tells you that you're too slow. April May takes the stand and has a titties wiggling animation, which is hilarious because of how many times I stopped the video to be like, see, they're making the most of every little bit of limited space they have. Every animation has to have a specific and crucial function. Every song, every set, every sound is precision engineered to make this masterpiece, and just booby animation, because of course. Edgeworth sort of picks at us and calls us cowards to pick apart her testimony. We press her and she cracks a bit, but Edgeworth objects at the exact right moment to interrupt us, and again, nothing really changes about where we are in the progression of this case, but just the feeling that if Winston Payne was the prosecutor here again, we could make her tell us everything in a few testimonies. The strength of this game in making Edgeworth feel like a really frustrating villain to face off against. We get a few contradictions. She should have noticed the clothes, and then somehow she knew the thinker was a clock. Phoenix looks pretty competent here, but this is still small potatoes. Phoenix even mentions that we've done this exact objection before. We're still building and letting the new features develop. The clock didn't ring, it had its clockwork removed. Past that, she couldn't have bought it from somewhere like she claims later, since it's a custom gift. It pains me to say this after the many titty wiggles we've had, but the little twitch under her eye is really, really good, with almost no extra storage at giving us the impression of her being furious. Edgeworth lets us finish, but he taps his forehead and smiles, and begins to counter our argument. And in response to his objection, the objection theme plays. The score treats both of these lawyers as level opponents and gives both of them the opportunity to be treated with a bit of fanfare. Edgeworth is wrong though, for the first time, and didn't realize Gumshoe gave us a phone with a conversation saying the clockwork was removed. And now, in response to the first chink in his armor, the big green himbo, Edgeworth slams his desk and his eyes pop out in fury. Finally, we get a breakdown animation as her heart button spins, she throws her hands past her face visually like ripping off a mask, and she has a really horrifying, furious look on her face. You'll be very surprised to hear that her tits are animated in a very deliberate full range of motion. We're bombarded with shakes and booms as May's face twists into a fury and she flips back into medium fury and then faked sweetness with her eyes twitching and flipping between models. We go in for the kill. April May knew about the clock because she held it in her hands. Or not. She couldn't have held it since, as we proved, the clock was empty. But she could have heard about it if she was wiretapping the victim's phone. Edgeworth insists it's irrelevant, but the judge says he's not sure it is. We have momentum, finally. April snaps again, has a nice animation of her fake crying, and her flipping between that and their little shadowy livid face is very funny. We've pretty much got her. We asked to call the bellboy to the stand, which Edgeworth agrees to on the condition that if we find nothing wrong, the case ends, which isn't how cases work, but as I've expressed, the most important thing here is that it's fun and gripping. It doesn't have to be realistic or true or coherent if it is engaging and fun. We see why Edgeworth imposed this condition. It seems really strongly like this bellboy has nothing to add. Panic sets in a bit. Again, it feels like our back is up against the wall. He has this insanely horny, blushing pose, which I think is very funny. This dude is a goon. After getting nowhere, the bellboy leaves and we protest, begging for one last question. This is a nice moment because no matter what we pick to ask about, check-in, room service, or bed making, we get dunked on by Edgeworth, and no matter what we pick, we actually get useful information that there was another person with April May. It's good writing. It really feels like we got super lucky and stumbled into a new clue. Edgeworth objects and says that was objectionable, which is hilarious, and the bellboy blushes and tells us that Edgeworth told him not to say it, to which Edgeworth oofs, and we finally make a red-white size crack in the case. This case isn't over yet, and we move for a second day of trial. Edgeworth has kind of a meltdown, and we successfully stall for another day. So I've got an entire other video for the next day of investigation and trial to make, so I won't linger here too long. Of note, though, is how natural and presupposed this first full day of cases. It's very easy to take for granted the pacing, the premise, and the new characters that very quickly turn into staples and fan favorites and long-standing main characters of their own games, but this case is really perfect. The reason it's easy to be hard on every game after this original trilogy is because this first game and this first case nailed it so effortlessly and set up an insanely high precedent for everything following it. If this case didn't establish Phoenix as a pretty likable and upstanding dude, if it didn't pause repeatedly to set up its plot beats and to really give everyone a chance to breathe and grow, if its pacing wasn't perfect, if it didn't maximize every animation, and okay fine, we'll lump the titty animation in there, if the score wasn't perfect and the stakes weren't really high, we wouldn't have gotten a Justice for All, let alone an Apollo Justice or a Great Ace Attorney. It's hard to examine this closely because there's no blueprint to compare it to, and that's even more impressive. So, thank you for being here. Let me know what you're thinking about this case right now. I love you. Take care.